Before we begin, welcome to Family Shadows, a place where the light and dark sides of family life meet, where love, loss, and betrayal intertwine to form stories you'll never forget. If you believe in the power of stories to touch the heart, I invite you to subscribe and join us every week. And now, tonight's story is titled, "My kids sold my late wife's ring without asking, so I took back the house." It's strange how you can live a whole life in the presence of something small and never realize how much of yourself you've poured into it until the day it's gone. Linda's wedding ring was not expensive by the standards of the world. No diamond big enough to blind anyone, no platinum band that caught the light in 1,000 glitters. It was a simple gold circle, with 2 initials carved on the inside, L+E, the plus scratched in with a penknife by my own nervous, 22-year-old hands the day I asked her to marry me. She had laughed when she saw it. "You ruined the inside," she teased. But she wore it for 40 years until the day she no longer could. And after she was gone, that ring stayed in a small walnut box on the dresser, not because I forgot it was there, but because I remembered too well. Some days I would open the box and run my thumb over the warm, worn metal, imagining her skin still inside it. Some days I'd close it quickly, afraid the memory might cut too deep, but it was always there, waiting, until the night I opened the box and it wasn't. I live in the house Linda and I bought together in 1988, a 2-story with a white porch and a maple tree out front that we planted ourselves. These days, I share it with my son Daniel and my daughter Sophie. Daniel is 34, serious, guarded, with a quick wit that reminds me of his mother on her best days and her stubbornness on her worst. Sophie, 29, still has that open, eager face of a little girl, but there's a hardness creeping in around the edges. When Linda died 3 years ago, I told myself keeping the family together under one roof would help us all heal. We'd share meals, talk about our days, and maybe, just maybe, keep her spirit alive in the walls of this house. But houses can't heal people. Sometimes they only trap the distance in the same rooms. It was a Tuesday evening late in the fall when I noticed the ring was gone. I had been dusting, an old habit Linda had drilled into me. The walnut box sat in its usual place, the tiny brass clasp warm under my fingers. But when I flipped it open, the black velvet cradle inside was empty. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks. Maybe I had moved it somewhere safer and forgotten. Maybe Sophie had cleaned and moved it to the jewelry case downstairs. But no, I knew that box like I knew the lines on my hands. It had only ever held that ring, nothing else. And the hollow it left, well, it felt like losing her all over again. That night at dinner, I sat across from Daniel and Sophie. They were chatting about a new cafe opening downtown, some friend's birthday party, and something about a bill being paid off. I stirred my soup and listened. "So yeah, it covered the car payment and we still had a little left over for groceries," Sophie was saying, spoon halfway to her mouth. "Lucky break," Daniel replied, smirking. My grip on the spoon tightened. "What covered the car payment?" I asked. They froze, the kind of freeze that tells you more than any words could. Sophie glanced at Daniel. Daniel looked back, his smirk gone. "Oh, just found something we didn't need anymore," Daniel said casually. "I didn't push, not yet. There's a kind of quiet that works better than shouting. I let the silence gather, let it sit at the table between us like an uninvited guest." That night, after they'd gone to bed, I drove to Marlowe's Pawn and Collectibles on the other side of town. The sign flickered in the dark, and the inside smelled like old coins and dust. Marlowe, the owner, has known me since high school. He didn't even make me explain. He just reached under the glass counter and pulled out a small tray. And there it was, Linda's ring, the initials inside catching the dull light. "I figured you'd be by," he said. "They told me they were in a pinch. I gave them a fair price. You can buy it back, Ed, but—" He hesitated. "It's not the money, is it?" "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's not the money. I didn't buy it back, not that night. I needed more than the ring in my hand, I needed the truth in theirs." On the drive home, the maple trees along the street blurred into shadows. I thought about the last time Linda had taken that ring off, the day the nurse slipped it from her finger because her hands had swollen from the medication. I had held it then, warm from her skin, and promised I'd keep it safe. Promises, it turns out, are harder to keep when they have to survive the living. Over the next few days, I watched my children differently. Not as the boy and girl who used to race each other up the porch steps after school, but as two adults capable of crossing a line I never thought they would. Sophie laughed on the phone with a friend, her voice light, as if nothing had happened. Daniel worked late, tapping away on his laptop, his face unreadable. I kept my silence, but inside something was shifting. There's a point when a father stops thinking about how to forgive and starts thinking about what this means. And what it meant to me was simple. If they could sell Linda's ring without asking, they could sell anything, even this house. The house was still in my name, always had been. When Linda passed, I never transferred ownership, never added Daniel or Sophie to the deed. It wasn't about control, it was about responsibility. And now, I was seeing the wisdom in that decision. Because a house, like a ring, is more than property. It's a promise. And if they could break one, maybe I had to break the other before they did. I didn't say a word to them that week. I let the silence grow roots. I let them think I hadn't noticed or didn't care. Because when the time came to speak, I wanted it to matter. I wanted the weight of my words to be heavier than the gold they'd traded for cash. And that time was coming sooner than they thought. If you're still here listening to this, maybe you understand. It's never just about the object. It's about what the object holds inside it, the love, the years, the trust. And when that's stolen, it's not just theft. It's a small death all over again. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the east-facing kitchen windows, spilling over the old oak table where Linda used to sit with her coffee and crossword puzzle. She had loved the mornings here before the world got too noisy, before the phone started ringing, before the kids left for school. Now the mornings were quieter, but not in the peaceful way. Sophie sat at the table scrolling through her phone, earbuds in, her spoon slowly chasing cereal around a bowl. Daniel had already left for work, or at least he said it was work. Sometimes I wondered if he just left to avoid conversation. I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. For a while, the only sounds were the faint hum of the refrigerator and the tinny beat leaking from Sophie's music. "You working today?" I asked. "Hum," she murmured without looking up. It struck me, not for the first time, how far we'd drifted from those mornings when she was a little girl, when she'd come into the kitchen still half asleep, hair sticking up in every direction, and climb onto my lap for the first sip of my coffee, making a face when it was too bitter. Now she barely looked at me. And maybe that was just how it went with grown kids, or maybe it was something more. The house itself hadn't changed much over the years. The walls still held family photographs, though some had been taken down after Linda passed. Too hard to look at, Sophie had said. The old upright piano still sat in the corner of the living room, the same one Daniel had plunked out Jingle Bells on when he was 7, and the maple tree out front still turned the brightest red in October, just as it had the fall we moved in. But there were cracks now, not the kind you patch with plaster, the kind you feel. Conversations were shorter. Meals were eaten in front of screens instead of together. We lived in the same space, but we were no longer part of the same story. I told myself it was grief, still lingering after 3 years. Grief has a way of making islands out of people, but the truth was harder. Maybe we just didn't see each other anymore. That evening Daniel came home late, the sound of his boots heavy on the hardwood floor. I was in the den, sorting through an old box of letters Linda had written me during our early years. "Long day?" I called out. "Yeah," he said, already halfway to the kitchen. "I'm starving." I heard the fridge door open, the clink of bottles, the scrape of a plate pulled from the cabinet. For a moment, I imagined getting up, walking in there, and asking him about the ring. Just asking. But I didn't, not yet. Instead, I sat there with one of Linda's letters in my lap, her handwriting curling across the page in blue ink. "Don't ever let the little things slip away from you, Ed. They'll be the things you miss the most." I wondered if she'd meant the little things like morning coffee or the little things like trust. On Thursday, I drove into town for groceries. The store was already stringing up Christmas lights, even though Thanksgiving hadn't arrived yet. Linda would have hated that. She liked the seasons to arrive on their own time. As I walked past the bakery section, I saw Mrs. Keaton, an old neighbor from down the street. She clasped my hands warmly the way she always had. "Edward Miller, I hardly see you these days," she said. "How's the family?" I hesitated a beat too long. "We're here," I said finally. She smiled politely, but her eyes searched mine for something else. "I heard about the ring," she said softly. I froze. "From Marlowe," she added quickly. "He's an old friend, you know, said he was surprised to see it come through his shop." I swallowed, the fluorescent lights suddenly too bright. "I suppose word gets around," I said. "Edward," she said, her voice lowering, "I know it's not my business, but that ring meant something. Don't let this go without speaking up." Her words followed me all the way home. That night, after Sophie had gone upstairs and Daniel was in his room, I wandered through the house turning off lights. The hallway was lined with framed photographs. The kids at the beach, Linda in her garden, our first Christmas here. Halfway down the hall was the picture I always stopped at, Linda on our wedding day, her eyes shining, that ring catching the afternoon sun. I touched the glass lightly as if I could feel her through it. In that moment, I knew there would be no quiet letting this pass. This wasn't a misunderstanding to smooth over. This was a choice they had made, and choices had consequences. I turned out the last light and stood in the darkened living room, listening to the faint creak of the house settling around me. The old maple tree brushed against the window, its branches tapping softly, like it was trying to remind me of something I already knew. By the time I went upstairs, I'd made a decision. I would give them a few more days, not to give them a chance to explain. If they'd wanted to, they already would have. But to give myself the time to decide exactly how to take back what mattered. Not just the ring, the house. And maybe, in some way, the part of myself I'd let go of when I stopped holding my children accountable for the weight of the promises they broke. The days that followed were the kind of days where the air felt heavier, though nothing visible had changed. The maple leaves outside had thinned, and the wind sent them skittering across the porch in restless little bursts. Inside, the house moved to its usual rhythm, footsteps overhead, the hum of the heater, the clink of plates in the sink. But underneath it all, there was something else. A silence that didn't just live in the pauses, it lived in the words that were never spoken. On Friday morning, I found myself standing in the kitchen staring at the empty walnut box again. I wasn't even sure why I'd opened it. It wasn't as though I expected the ring to have found its way home, but there's a part of you when something is taken that still believes in the absurd possibility of its return. Daniel came in heading straight for the coffee pot. He was wearing a pressed shirt, but there was a tired edge in his eyes. "Morning," I said. "Morning," he replied without looking up. I watched him pour his coffee, add cream, take a sip. It was the same ritual I'd seen 1,000 times, but this morning it felt like I was watching a stranger. Sophie drifted in a few minutes later, wrapped in a sweatshirt that had belonged to Linda. She'd cut the sleeves short, the edges fraying where the scissors had been careless. Linda used to fold her sleeves just so, always neat, even when she was gardening. Seeing the sweatshirt like that, casual, altered, made something in my chest twist. "You two around Sunday evening?" I asked, my voice steady. Daniel glanced at Sophie, then back at me. "I think so." "Why?" "I thought we could have a proper dinner together," I said. "It's been a while." Sophie smiled faintly. "Sure, that sounds nice." I nodded, though inside I felt a flicker of something sharper than anticipation. Over the next 2 days, I found myself preparing in ways I couldn't quite explain to anyone else. I went to the market early Sunday morning, picking out the kind of roast Linda used to make on holidays. I bought fresh rosemary, the good butter, the green beans still on the vine. If there was going to be a reckoning, I wanted it to happen over the kind of meal that reminded them what family was supposed to feel like, before we talked about what it had become. The house smelled of roasting meat and herbs by late afternoon, the kind of smell that reached into every room and made the walls feel warmer. I set the table with the old china we hadn't used in years, the edges still gleaming faintly from the last time Linda polished them. The silverware clinked softly as I placed it, each sound deliberate, almost ceremonial. Around 5:30, Sophie appeared in the doorway, her hair tied up, the scent of perfume trailing after her. "Smells amazing," she said, a genuine note in her voice. "Thank you," I replied. Daniel followed soon after, phone in hand, typing something quickly before slipping it into his pocket. He gave the table a brief glance. "We expecting company?" "Just us," I said. "Family." They took their seats, the scrape of chairs on the hardwood floor the only sound for a moment. I ladled the gravy into the serving dish, passed the breadbasket, watched as they filled their plates. We talked about ordinary things at first, Sophie's work schedule, Daniel's car trouble, the weather. But all the while, I could feel the other conversation circling us like a shadow just outside the room, waiting to step in. Halfway through the meal, I set my fork down. The sound of it on the plate was small, but it made both of them look at me. "I went to Marlowe's this week," I said. My voice was calm, but the air shifted. Sophie's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. He showed me something, I continued, something I recognized. I let the words hang there, the space between us tightening. Sophie blinked. "Dad, I raised a hand, not sharply, but enough to still her voice. "We'll talk about it, all of it, but not yet. For now, just eat. We'll have that conversation before dessert." Neither of them said anything, but the clink of silverware on porcelain grew slower, more careful. I could almost hear their thoughts racing, the way an engine revs just before the brake is pressed. By the time the roast was gone and the plates had been cleared, the sun had set, leaving only the warm glow of the chandelier above the table. I brought out the coffee and pie, placing them in the center, but I didn't sit back down right away. Instead, I went to the sideboard and took out the manila envelope I'd tucked there earlier. Inside were the photographs I'd taken of the ring at Marlowe's, along with the pawn slip he'd shown me. I didn't lay them on the table just yet. I wanted them to feel the weight of the moment before they saw the proof. As I sat back down, I thought of Linda, of the way she used to rest her hand on mine when we faced something difficult together. I could almost feel the pressure of her fingers now, steady and sure. "All right," I said quietly, "let's talk about the ring." And in the stillness that followed, I knew there was no turning back. For a moment, no one moved. The chandelier's light pooled over the table, catching the edges of the coffee cups, the faint sheen of the pie crust, the silver forks resting in silence. Daniel's gaze flicked to Sophie, then back to me, measuring. Sophie stared down at her plate as if the right words might be hiding between crumbs. "I'm not going to ask if you did it," I began. "Because I already know you did." Daniel straightened in his chair. "Dad, I saw it," I said, my voice cutting through his. "At Marlowe's, the initials inside, the little nick on the band where it caught the edge of the counter once. I'd know that ring anywhere." Sophie's shoulders sagged, her eyes didn't leave the table. "We needed the money." I nodded slowly. "That's what I figured you'd say." Daniel leaned forward, elbows on the table. It wasn't just about the money. We thought," he stopped, jaw tightening. "We thought maybe it was better not to have it lying around. It's been years since Mom passed. Maybe letting it go." I held up a hand, palm out. "Don't you dare dress this up as something noble." The words landed heavier than I expected. Sophie's eyes flicked up, wet and sharp. "We didn't think it mattered this much to you," she whispered. I looked at her, feeling the ache in my chest settle into something harder. "Then you haven't been paying attention." That ring was the last thing she wore before she left this world. It was the only promise we ever made to each other that still existed in the world you can hold in your hand. I reached for the manila envelope, slid the photographs and pawn slip onto the table. The paper whispered as it moved. "Marlowe didn't even want to show me these. Said he figured there must be a good reason my own children would bring him something like this." Daniel's face went red. We were behind on bills. Sophie's car needed repairs. I've been trying to cover rent on the place. "The place you don't even own." I interrupted, my voice still calm but colder now. You've been living here under this roof without paying a cent toward the mortgage, because there is no mortgage. This house is paid for by me and by your mother. Silence. Then Sophie, in a small voice, we didn't think you'd understand. I leaned back, my hands flat on the table. Understand what? That you sold the last piece of your mother without asking. That you took something you didn't own because it was easier than asking for help. Daniel's voice rose, frustration breaking through. We're not kids anymore, Dad. We've got lives, problems. And so did we, I said sharply. When you were small, when your mother and I scraped through winters with a broken furnace, when we paid off this house one check at a time, we didn't pawn the things that mattered. We found another way. The room seemed to shrink, the air pressing closer. Sophie wiped at her eyes, but the tears kept coming. Daniel just stared at me, jaw tight, like he was holding back words that might split the night open even further. Finally, I pushed the papers toward them. Here's what I understand now. If you could sell that ring without thinking twice, you could do the same with anything else in this house, including the house itself. Daniel frowned. What are you saying? I'm saying, I replied, my voice low but steady, that this roof over your head exists because I let it, and after tonight that changes. Sophie looked up, eyes wide. Dad, you can't be serious. I'm entirely serious, I said. You've both been living here under the assumption that it belongs to you as much as it does to me. But it doesn't, it never has. This house is mine, still in my name, and in 1 week it won't be your address anymore. The words hung there like smoke. Sophie's chair scraped back, the sound jagged in the quiet. So you're just kicking us out. Her voice cracked. Over a ring. I met her eyes. Not over a ring, over trust. Over the fact that when you broke it, you didn't come to me, didn't even think you needed to. You just took. Daniel's fists tightened on the table. And what? You think this makes you the hero here? No, I said, pushing back my own chair. It makes me the one person in this house who still understands what it means to keep a promise. I stood, gathering the plates not because they needed clearing, but because the weight of the conversation had made the table unbearable. Neither of them moved to help. When I turned toward the kitchen, I caught sight of the photograph of Linda on the wall, her smile gentle, her eyes calm. For a second, I imagined she was standing behind me, her hand on my shoulder, steadying me, because in the week ahead I was going to need it. The house felt different the next morning, not in the way you notice when someone moves furniture or paints a wall, but in the way the air itself feels heavier. Daniel left early, the slam of the front door sharper than usual. Sophie stayed upstairs, her footsteps pacing back and forth above me like a metronome marking time in some slow, uneasy song. I made coffee in the kitchen, the morning sun catching the steam as it curled up from the cup. In the old days, Linda would have been there, slicing fruit, humming along to the radio. Now there was just the faint tick of the wall clock and the echo of last night's words still hanging in the air. I didn't regret saying them, but I felt the weight of them heavy as stone. By midweek, we'd settled into a kind of stalemate. Daniel and Sophie spoke to me only when necessary, a clipped question about the mail, a muttered "I'm heading out." Meals were taken separately. The dining table, once the center of the house, sat unused, chairs tucked in neatly as if it were waiting for a family that no longer lived here. At night, I'd walk through the darkened living room, the glow of the street lamp spilling across the floorboards, and think about the years we'd filled this place with noise. Birthdays, arguments over homework, Linda calling us in from the yard when dinner was ready. All of it had been loud, messy, alive. Now the quiet was so deep it had its own presence. On Thursday afternoon, I sat at my desk with the deed to the house spread out before me. My name, no one else's. I ran my fingers over the embossed seal, thinking about the day Linda and I signed it. She'd worn that ring then, her hand warm in mine as we inked our names. There's a peculiar kind of loneliness in knowing you're the last one still guarding the things you built together. I started making lists, things to sort, things to store, things to leave behind. I didn't want to throw Daniel and Sophie out onto the street without warning, but I also couldn't pretend I'd made a hollow threat. That evening, I caught Sophie in the hallway. She had her purse over her shoulder, keys in hand. "Going out?" I asked. "Yeah," she said without stopping. I stepped aside, letting her pass, but as she reached the front door, I called after her. "Sophie." She turned just enough to meet my eyes. "I'm sorry it's come to this," I said. Her expression flickered, something between hurt and defiance, and then she was gone. The door clicked shut behind her and the house seemed to exhale. Friday brought rain. It drummed softly on the roof, the sound threading through the rooms. I found myself in the den, sorting through the old walnut box again, though it was still empty. I could have gone back to Marlowe's and bought the ring on the spot, but something in me resisted. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe I needed Daniel and Sophie to understand that you can't just erase damage by replacing what's been taken. Late that night, I stood at the kitchen sink, looking out at the wet driveway glistening under the streetlight. I thought about the day they'd leave the packed boxes, the echo of their footsteps fading down the hall. And I thought about how, when the door closed behind them, I'd be left alone in this house. I wasn't sure if the quiet that followed would feel like punishment or relief, but either way it was coming. Sunday morning arrived gray and still, the kind of morning that makes sound feel muffled, as though the world is wrapped in wool. I woke early, long before either Daniel or Sophie stirred, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad in front of me. I'd written and torn up 3 versions of what I needed to say. Each one sounded too cold, or too soft, or too much like a father begging his children to understand. But this wasn't about begging. It was about making the lines clear. By the time I heard the first creak of the stairs, the note was folded in my shirt pocket. Not because I planned to hand it to them, I'd say it out loud, but because having the words there gave me something solid to hold on to. Daniel came down first, hair uncombed, rubbing his eyes. He poured himself coffee without a word. Sophie followed soon after, wrapped in a blanket like she was shielding herself from more than just the morning chill. I waited until both of them were sitting. The hum of the heater filled the pause. "I meant what I said last week," I began. Daniel's eyes stayed on his mug. Sophie shifted under the blanket, her fingers curling in the fabric. "This house is mine," I continued, "and I won't have people living under this roof who can take what isn't theirs without a word. You have until Friday to make other arrangements." Sophie's head snapped up. "That's 5 days, Dad. That's 5 days more than you gave me before you sold the ring," I said quietly. Daniel set his mug down harder than necessary. "You think kicking us out fixes anything? You think Mom would have wanted this?" The mention of her name was like striking flint. "Your mother," I said slowly, "would have wanted her children to understand what loyalty means. She would have wanted them to come to me if they needed help, not go behind my back." "That's easy to say when you're not the one drowning," Daniel shot back. I leaned forward, my voice low but steady. "I've been drowning before, son. I just never dragged someone else under with me to breathe easier." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Sophie's eyes filled, but she blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. "Where are we supposed to go?" "You're adults," I said, though the words felt like they weighed more than I could carry. "You'll figure it out. I did at your age." She stood abruptly, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. "It's not the same, Dad. It's not the same world you grew up in." "Maybe not," I said, "but it's still a world where trust matters." They both left the table without finishing their coffee, retreating to their rooms. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind of quiet that hums with the things people wish they'd said, the kind that seeps into the walls. I sat there a while longer, my coffee growing cold, looking out the window at the maple tree swaying in the wind. When Linda and I planted it, we'd talked about how, in 30 years, its branches would be wide enough to shade the whole yard. She'd been right. It struck me then that maybe this house had become exactly that tree, sheltering people who no longer understood the roots it grew from. And on Friday, I would be the one cutting that shelter away. The days between Sunday and Friday seemed to stretch in strange ways, hours dragging when we were in the same room, then disappearing entirely when I found myself alone. Monday morning, I left early for the hardware store, even though I didn't need anything urgent. Sometimes absence is easier than sitting in the same kitchen with words hanging unsaid between you. When I came back, Daniel's truck was gone. Sophie's car was in the driveway, but the blinds to her room were drawn. I thought of knocking, of trying again to bridge whatever had cracked so deeply, but instead I put the groceries away and let the house stay quiet. That night, while I was reading in the den, I heard muffled voices upstairs. At first it was just a low hum, but then Daniel's voice rose, sharp with frustration. "We don't have a choice," he was saying. "He's not bluffing." Sophie's reply was softer, harder to make out. "I know, but it's still our home," she said finally, the words breaking on the last syllable. I sat there, book in hand but eyes fixed on the darkened hallway, realizing that this was the first time I'd heard either of them call it our home in weeks. Tuesday passed much the same. They spoke to me only when they had to, and even then their words came clipped, like each one cost too much to give away. I caught Daniel looking at the framed wedding photo in the hall once, his jaw tightening before he turned away. That night I stood at the kitchen sink washing a coffee cup when Sophie came in. She didn't say anything, just reached for a glass of water. I glanced at her, waiting for her to leave, but instead she lingered. "Do you ever think about Mom?" she asked quietly, eyes fixed on the counter. "Every day," I said. She nodded once, then slipped out of the room, and just like that the moment was gone. By Wednesday, boxes had appeared in Daniel's room. I saw them when I passed his open door, half filled, stacked unevenly against the wall. Sophie hadn't started packing, at least not where I could see. I wondered if she was holding out hope that I might change my mind at the last minute. I didn't blame her for hoping. Part of me was still hoping too, though I couldn't have said for what. That night, I dreamed of Linda. She was sitting at the kitchen table, wearing the same soft blue sweater she'd worn every winter, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug. She didn't say anything, just looked at me with that steady gaze that made me feel both seen and measured. When I woke, the space beside me in the bed felt colder than usual. Thursday brought a kind of uneasy calm. Daniel came home with takeout, left a container on the counter for me without a word, then retreated to his room. Sophie went out for most of the day, returning just before dark. I heard her moving around upstairs, the thump of drawers closing, the rustle of bags. After dinner, I stepped out onto the porch. The maple tree swayed gently, its branches tapping against the siding. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles deep in your bones. I stood there for a long time, watching the lights in the houses down the block, wondering if any of the families inside were sitting together, talking, laughing, or if they too were learning that you can love someone and still be worlds apart. When I came back inside, the house was still. I passed the walnut box on the dresser in my room, my hand hovering over it. Empty or not, it still felt like it held the weight of everything that had brought us here. Tomorrow, it would no longer be their home. And no matter how certain I'd been of my decision, I knew the leaving would change more than just the address on their driver's licenses. It would change us. Friday morning came without ceremony. No bright sun breaking through the clouds, no sudden shift in the air, just the same gray light that had been hanging over the week, heavy and quiet. I woke before my alarm and lay still for a while, listening. The house had a different sound now, more hollow, as if it already knew it was about to lose voices it had grown used to. From upstairs came the muffled thud of boxes being moved, the scrape of tape being pulled from a roll. Somewhere, a dresser drawer slid open, then shut with a firm push. These weren't the soft, lived-in sounds of a home, they were the noises of a place being dismantled. By mid-morning, the hallway was lined with boxes. Daniel came down with two of them stacked in his arms, his expression unreadable. He didn't say good morning. Neither did I. He set the boxes by the front door, then went back upstairs without looking at me. Sophie followed a little later, carrying a laundry basket filled with clothes. She wore a sweatshirt with the hood pulled up, though the house wasn't cold. I stood in the kitchen, watching them move through the space like people who had once belonged here but now were only passing through. Every so often, one of them would glance at the photographs on the wall, then quickly look away. Around noon, Daniel's truck pulled into the driveway. A friend of his, someone I didn't know well, stepped out to help load. The thump of boxes hitting the truck bed echoed in the quiet street. I stayed inside, leaning against the counter, hands wrapped around a mug I hadn't sipped from in 10 minutes. From where I stood, I could see the maple tree swaying gently out front. We'd planted it when Daniel was 10 and Sophie was 5. They'd each pressed their small hands into the soil that day, giggling as Linda showed them how to pat it down. Now, years later, those same hands were carrying their lives out the front door. When the last box was loaded, Sophie stepped back inside. She hesitated in the entryway, then walked into the kitchen. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said quietly. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. I nodded once, not trusting myself to speak just yet. "I didn't think it would hurt you like this," she went on. I don't know what I thought. I set the mug down. You didn't think to ask, that's what hurt." She lowered her gaze, gave a small nod, and walked back out. Daniel was last. He came to the doorway, hands in his jacket pockets, his stance more guarded than hers. "I still think you're overreacting," he said. "Maybe I am," I replied, "but I'd rather overreact to losing trust than sit here and watch the rest of what matters disappear." For a moment, it looked like he might say more, but he didn't. He just gave a single, sharp nod, turned, and walked out. The truck's engine rumbled to life. I stood at the window and watched as it backed out of the driveway. Sophie looked down at her phone. Daniel kept his eyes on the road. Neither of them looked back. When the sound of the truck faded, the silence that followed felt bigger than the house itself. I walked through each room slowly, like I was making sure the place was still standing. The hallway seemed longer. The living room echoed more. Even the kitchen light felt different. In the bedroom, I passed the walnut box on the dresser. It was still empty, but somehow today it felt heavier than it ever had. I went out to the porch and sat in the old wooden chair Linda used to favor. The maple tree's branches swayed above me, their shadows stretching across the yard. For the first time in a long while, I let myself wonder what she would say if she were here. Would she tell me I'd done the right thing, or would she tell me I'd let the last threads of our family slip away? The truth was, I didn't know, but the house was mine again, and for now, that would have to be enough. The first night alone in the house, I didn't turn on many lights, not out of thrift, but because it felt wrong to flood the rooms with brightness when no one was in them. The living room lamp cast a warm pool over my chair, the rest of the space fading into shadow. I made a simple dinner, eggs, toast, a cup of tea, and ate it at the kitchen counter. Without the sound of other voices, every small noise felt louder. The scrape of the fork on the plate, the tick of the clock, the low hum of the refrigerator. I told myself it would take time to adjust, but in the pit of my stomach, I knew this wasn't the kind of quiet you ever truly get used to. The next morning, I woke early. The sun was just starting to push through the blinds, painting thin stripes of light across the bedroom floor. I stayed in bed longer than usual, listening to the house settle, the soft creak of the floorboards, the sigh of the heating system. In the hallway, the walls looked almost bare without the shoes and jackets that used to pile near the door. The living room was tidy in a way it hadn't been in years, and yet, it didn't feel clean so much as stripped. I passed the empty walnut box on the dresser again. For a moment, I considered driving to Marlowe's and buying the ring back, but I didn't move. The thought sat there, heavy and unmoving, until I turned away. By Wednesday, the days had started blending. I kept the radio on low, more for the company of a human voice than for the music. I did chores slowly, dragging them out to fill the hours, sweeping the porch, tightening a loose cabinet hinge, reorganizing the pantry even though it didn't need it. In the afternoons, I found myself standing at the window, looking out at the maple tree. The branches had shed most of their leaves, the last few clinging stubbornly to the ends. Linda used to say that was her favorite part of the season, when the tree knows it's almost bare, but still refuses to let go. I wondered what she would think of me now, whether she'd see a man protecting what they'd built together, or a man letting go of the wrong things. On Thursday, I went into Sophie's old room. The air still held the faint scent of her shampoo, and a small stack of paperbacks sat forgotten on the nightstand. I ran my hand over the quilt folded at the end of the bed. One Linda had made the year Sophie turned 12, each patch cut from pieces of fabric tied to some memory. In Daniel's room, the desk was empty except for a pen left without its cap. The wastebasket still held a crumpled grocery receipt. The smallest, most ordinary thing seemed to press the hardest. That night, as I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, I thought about what comes after an ending. People like to say you move on, but I wasn't sure that was the right shape for it. Moving on implies leaving something behind. This felt more like carrying it, the loss, the anger, the quiet, in a different way. The street was still. The maple's bare branches swayed in the dark, their shadows shifting across the lawn. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once, then stopped. I closed my eyes and imagined Linda sitting beside me, her hand warm over mine. In the quiet, I could almost hear her voice. "You've kept the promise, but promises aren't the same as love." When I opened my eyes again, the chair next to me was empty, and the night felt bigger than I wanted to admit. It was a little after 7 on Friday evening when the knock came. 3 firm raps, not hurried, not timid, just steady enough to carry through the quiet house. I was in the den, half listening to the low hum of the radio, a cup of coffee cooling beside me. For a moment I thought I'd imagined it. People don't just show up at your door unannounced much anymore, not in this neighborhood. The knock came again. I set down the mug and made my way to the front hall. Through the narrow glass pane beside the door, I saw a shape, broad-shouldered, head slightly bowed against the wind. When I opened it, Marlowe stood there, his coat dusted with the early frost that had settled over the evening. "Ed," he said, his voice carrying the kind of gravity that told me this wasn't just a neighborly drop-by. "Marlowe," I replied, holding the door wider. "Come in before you freeze." He stepped inside, stamping the cold from his boots. In his hands was a small paper bag folded neatly at the top. "I wasn't sure if I should come," he said, "but I figured it was better than not." We moved to the kitchen, where the air was still warm from the afternoon's heating cycle. Marlowe set the bag gently on the table, then slid it toward me. I knew what was inside before I opened it. The ring lay in a small velvet pouch, the same worn band, the same carved initials. I tipped it into my palm, the metal cool against my skin. "You bought it back," I said quietly. He nodded. "Couldn't stand the thought of it sitting on a shelf waiting for the wrong hands. Figured you'd come for it eventually. But then I heard the kids had moved out, and I thought," he paused, studying my face. "Well, I thought maybe now was the time." I turned the ring over in my hand, tracing the groove of the L and E with my thumb. The last time I'd held it, Linda's warmth had still been there. Now it felt like something dug out of the earth, stripped of the life it had known. "I appreciate it," I said, my voice low. "Ed," Marlowe said gently, "I've known you a long time, long enough to know you don't make decisions lightly, but I've also seen what holding too tight can do to a man." I looked up at him, but he didn't press further. He just stood there, the kitchen light catching in the silver of his hair, the quiet between us carrying more weight than his words. After he left, I sat at the table with the ring in front of me. I couldn't bring myself to put it back in the walnut box, not yet. It sat there, catching the light, as if waiting for me to decide what it meant now. Through the window, the maple tree's bare branches swayed against the dark sky. Somewhere deep in me, I felt the smallest shift, not forgiveness, not yet, but something close to the space where it might someday live. I closed my hand around the ring and sat there in the stillness, feeling its weight settle into my palm, and into the week ahead, where I knew the story between me and my children wasn't finished. It was Sunday afternoon, 2 days after Marlowe had placed the ring back into my hand. I'd moved it into the walnut box the next morning, not because I was ready to lock it away again, but because I couldn't stand to see it lying out on the table like a wound that wouldn't close. The day was cold and bright, the kind of winter sun that bleaches the color from everything. I was on the porch with a blanket over my legs, sipping coffee, watching the steam curl away into the air. That's when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number right away. It was local, but not one I had saved. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hello." There was a pause, then Sophie's voice, small, cautious. "Hi, Dad." It had been just over a week since I'd heard her voice in more than a few clipped sentences. Hearing it now was like stepping into a room you hadn't realized you missed until you were standing inside it. "Sophie," I said, "everything all right?" Another pause. "Not exactly." I didn't know who else to call. She explained in a rush. The apartment she'd found with a coworker had plumbing issues, bad ones. The kind that send water seeping under doors and soaking into carpets. The landlord was slow to respond. They'd been told repairs could take a week. "I'm not asking to move back in," she added quickly, as if she could hear me tightening on the other end of the line. I don't have anywhere else to go right now." Her voice wavered on the last few words. I sat back, looking out at the bare branches of the maple tree. Part of me wanted to say yes without thinking, the part that still saw her as a little girl climbing into my lap on cold mornings. But another part remembered the empty walnut box, the way she couldn't meet my eyes that night at the table. "Where are you now?" I asked finally. "In my car, parked a few blocks from work." "You've eaten?" "Yeah," she said, though I wasn't sure I believed her. I rubbed a hand over my face. "All right, you can come here, just for a few days, until your place is livable again." The relief in her exhale was almost imperceptible, but I heard it. "Thank you, Dad." When she arrived an hour later, she carried only a duffel bag. She stepped inside slowly, as if unsure whether she was walking into a home or a test she might fail. The house seemed to inhale her presence, the sound of her shoes on the floor, the faint scent of her shampoo. I gestured toward the guest room. "You can stay there. Fresh sheets are in the closet." She nodded, heading down the hall. From the doorway, I watched her go, feeling the strange collision of relief and unease. Part of me wanted her here. Part of me wasn't sure I was ready for what that meant. In the walnut box upstairs, the ring rested quietly, its weight unchanged, but the ground beneath this house was already shifting again. The first morning Sophie was back, the house woke differently. I could hear the faint rush of the shower upstairs, the creak of floorboards in the hallway. The smells of her shampoo and body wash drifted down the stairs before she did. She came into the kitchen wearing a sweater I didn't recognize, hair damp and pulled back, her phone in hand. "Morning," she said softly, almost as if she wasn't sure she had the right to use the word here anymore. "Morning," I replied, pouring coffee into a second mug and sliding it toward her. She accepted it with a small nod. No sugar, no cream, just how she used to drink it when she was trying to prove she could keep up with me on early mornings before school. We stood in that kitchen, the two of us leaning against opposite counters, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space where conversation might have been. The days settled into a kind of uneasy rhythm. She spent most of her daylight hours at work, came back in the evenings with takeout boxes or leftovers she'd picked at on her lunch break. I cooked some nights, but we rarely ate at the same time. There were brief moments, small, fleeting things where the air seemed to thaw. One evening, she laughed at something on the TV and without thinking told me about a ridiculous customer she'd had that day. I laughed too, and for a second it felt almost normal. But then the quiet would return, as if both of us had remembered the boundary between where we were and where we'd been. On the third night, I found her in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the rug with a stack of photo albums spread around her. She looked up, half smiling. I forgot how many of these we had. She flipped a page and there was Linda, standing in the garden with a straw hat on, holding up a tomato the size of her fist. Sophie touched the picture lightly with her fingertips. "She always said she was going to teach me how to grow them," Sophie murmured. "I never learned." I eased down into the armchair across from her. "It's not too late." Her eyes flicked to mine, holding them for a heartbeat longer than they usually did these days. Then she nodded and closed the album gently, stacking it with the others. Still, the undercurrent remained. One afternoon, I came home from the hardware store and found the walnut box slightly askew on the dresser. It was still closed, but I could tell it had been moved. At dinner that night, I asked without looking up from my plate, "Did you go into my room today?" Sophie froze mid-bite. Yeah, I was looking for extra blankets." I met her eyes then, holding her gaze just long enough for her to look away. We didn't talk about it again, but the space between us that night felt wider than it had the day before. By Friday, the repairs on her apartment were almost finished. She told me she'd probably move back over the weekend. I nodded, not showing the flicker of something, not quite sadness, not quite relief that went through me. That night, she came into the kitchen while I was drying dishes. "Thanks for letting me stay," she said. "I know I didn't make it easy." "You're still my daughter," I replied. She smiled faintly, but there was something in her eyes, a question neither of us was ready to ask, much less answer. And so the week ended like it began, with the house holding more between its walls than either of us was willing to speak aloud. Saturday morning came with a sky the color of pewter, the kind that warns of snow even if the forecast doesn't say so. Sophie's things were already by the door when I came downstairs, the same duffel bag she'd carried in a week earlier, now zipped and slouched against the wall. She was in the kitchen making toast. "Morning," she said, her voice light in a way that felt practiced. "Morning," I replied, pouring myself coffee. We ate at the counter, each with our own plate, the scrape of cutlery soft against the plates. There was a sense of time pressing in on us, the kind that comes when you both know someone is leaving and neither of you is sure what the right last words should be. Around 10, she loaded the bag into her car. The air outside had that sharp, dry bite of approaching winter. She lingered by the driver's side door, hands in her jacket pockets. "Thanks again," she said. "You already thanked me," I replied. She gave a small, crooked smile. "Yeah, well, I wanted to make sure you heard it." For a moment, I thought she might say something more, maybe about the ring, maybe about the night I told them to leave. But she didn't. She just nodded once, slid into the car, and drove away. The house settled back into stillness almost immediately, as if it had been waiting to exhale. I walked through each room, not looking for anything in particular. In the guest room, the bed was neatly made. On the nightstand sat a folded note. My name was written on the front in her handwriting. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single line. "I'll make it right, Dad, I promise." Beneath the note lay the ring, not Linda's, but a small silver band I recognized from Sophie's own jewelry box. It wasn't worth much in money, but it was hers. Something she wore almost every day since college. She'd left it there, I realized, not because I needed it, but because she understood what it meant to keep something safe. I set the note back down and closed my hand around the silver band. It was warm from the room, not from her skin, but somehow it carried a trace of her. For the first time in weeks, I felt a shift inside me, small but undeniable. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the faint outline of a bridge where there had only been distance. In the walnut box upstairs, Linda's ring waited quietly, and now beside it there would be another. It was a Tuesday evening, cold enough that the wind rattled the loose gutter over the porch. I was in the living room, reading by the lamp when the knock came. Not the same steady, deliberate one Marlowe had used weeks ago. This one was harder, quicker, with an urgency behind it. When I opened the door, Daniel was standing there. His jacket was unzipped, his hair damp from the drizzle, his eyes sharper than I remembered. "Hey," he said, not Dad, just hey. For a moment, neither of us moved. I could smell the cold on him, that metallic tang the air gets just before a real frost sets in. "What's going on?" I asked, glanced past me into the house, then back. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside, and he crossed the threshold like someone unsure whether they were welcome but too tired to care. In the kitchen, he sat at the table without taking off his coat. "I wouldn't be here if I had another option," he began. I leaned against the counter. "Go on." "My place," he hesitated, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "There was a fire in the building. Not my unit, but the smoke damage is bad. They're saying it could be weeks before it's safe to go back." "Insurance?" I asked. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Still processing. In the meantime, I've got nowhere to stay." I studied him for a moment. He looked older than he had a month ago, or maybe it was just the wear in his expression. "You know what you're asking," I said. "Yeah," he replied quietly. "I also know I don't deserve it." The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. It wasn't an apology, but it was close enough to make the air between us shift. I pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down. "You can stay, but it's temporary, and we're going to talk about what happened before." He nodded once. "Fair." We didn't shake hands, didn't seal the agreement with anything more than that single word, but something unspoken passed between us, not trust, not yet, but the smallest step toward it. That night, after Daniel had taken his bag to the guest room, I found myself upstairs at the dresser. I opened the walnut box, looking at Linda's ring beside Sophie's silver band. 2 different promises, 2 different breaches, and maybe, just maybe, 2 different chances to see if either could be mended. The first morning Daniel was back, the house felt different from when Sophie had returned. I came downstairs to find him at the counter, pouring cereal into a bowl. He nodded at me, not quite making eye see. We moved around each other in the kitchen like 2 men sharing a motel room, polite enough to avoid For the first few days, he spent most of his time in the guest room or out of the house. One evening I was in the garage sorting through a box of old tools when he came in. "Do you still have Mom's garden shears?" he asked. "They're in the shed," I said. "Why?" "Thought I'd trim the maple a bit. It's getting close to the power line." It was the first time in years he'd offered to fix something without being asked. We worked on the tree together the next afternoon. The sun was pale, the air sharp, and the sound of the clippers made a clean rhythm against the winter stillness. We didn't talk much, but the silence felt different out there, less like distance, more like a pause that didn't need filling. At one point he said, "Mom always liked this tree best in winter, said it looked honest without the leaves." I glanced at him. She did. And then we went back to trimming, each of us holding on to that shared memory like a rope pulled from opposite ends. Still, the old tension wasn't gone. One night, I found my dresser drawer slightly open, nothing missing, but the sight of it stirred something in me. Over dinner the next day I said, "If you need something, you ask." Daniel set down his fork. "I wasn't looking for the ring, if that's what you think." "I'm telling you either way," I said. He didn't argue, but the way he looked at me said he'd heard more in my words than I'd spoken. By the end of the week, the guest room no longer felt like a stranger's space. His jacket hung on the back of a chair, his boots left by the door. He'd started making more coffee than just for himself in the mornings. Small things, but noticeable. One night, as I was turning off the porch light, I saw him in the living room looking at the framed photo of Linda in her garden. He didn't know I was there. He reached out, touched the frame lightly, then turned away. I went upstairs without saying anything, the image of that small gesture following me into sleep. Daniel stayed for just under 3 weeks. By the time he left, the snow had come and gone twice, and the maple tree in the yard stood bare against a sky the color of pewter. His building repairs were finished. He'd found a place to stay closer to work. The morning he moved out, there was no big conversation. He carried his bag to the door, zipped his jacket, and said, "Thanks, Dad." I nodded. "Take care of yourself." He gave a quick smile, not wide, but real, and stepped out into the cold. I stood at the window and watched him walk to his truck, the frost crunching under his boots. He didn't look back, but I didn't expect him to. When the engine faded down the street, I moved through the house slowly. The guest room was empty again, but not quite the same as before. There was a coffee mug in the sink that wasn't mine, a jacket hanger left behind in the closet, and a faint smell of wood smoke from his coat that lingered in the air. In the living room, the photograph of Linda in her garden caught the morning light. I paused there, letting the warmth from the window touch my face. Upstairs, in the walnut box, Linda's gold ring sat beside Sophie's silver band. 2 promises, both broken once, both left in my care again. I realized then that what stayed in this house was never just the things. It was the traces, the smell of coffee in the kitchen, the dent in the couch cushion where someone used to sit, the memory of laughter in the hall. And maybe that was enough for now. Not a perfect ending, not the way Linda would have written it, but something that could still grow if given time. I went to the porch, sat in her old wooden chair, and looked at the bare branches swaying above the yard. Winter always made the tree look fragile, but I knew, come spring, it would bloom again. Some things take longer to heal than others. Thank you for listening to this story on family shadows. I hope it's a reminder that even in the middle of conflict, there's always room for understanding, and that the ties we share with family, though sometimes strained, are worth holding on to. I wish you and your loved ones health, peace, and moments of true happiness together. Take care of one another, and may your own family stories be filled with more love than loss.